The first days of any season in the rural southern counties possess a heaviness that settles not only upon the air, but upon the minds of those who must labor beneath it. And in the year 1837, the damp mornings along the courthouse road felt especially weighted with a silence that seemed not passive but watchful, as if the earth itself were waiting for some breach in the long-maintained order. Elias, the enslaved servant attached to the household of County Magistrate Thomas Halbert, rose before dawn each day into this atmosphere of expectant quiet, carrying within him an inward world defined by stillness, calculation, and a careful observation that no one around him suspected. Such inner landscape had been formed by years of listening more than speaking, reading more than reacting, and surviving more than living. He rose from the pallet laid near the magistrate's office outbuilding, washed with the cold well water that numbed the skin yet awakened the senses, and prepared himself for another day of movement through a society arranged so rigidly that any departure from its coded gestures might incite danger. Every morning, the courthouse road bore the same sounds: wagon wheels groaning through the clay ruts, hooves thudding against the half-dry earth, the murmured exchanges between farmers conveying early produce or small claims to be presented before the magistrate. Beyond these predictable noises existed a more delicate register: the click of chain links at the wrists or ankles of those brought in for judgment, the scraping shuffle of a plantation worker forced to march under the eye of an overseer, the soft rustle of papers carried by clerks who looked at no one they considered beneath them. Elias heard all of it with the precision of someone who knew that survival depended upon absorbing details unnoticed by others. He walked with a deliberate slowness, performing the exact posture expected of him: eyes lowered, shoulders angled slightly downward, hands kept visible, yet his mind catalogued every motion around him: who greeted whom, who stepped aside, who muttered complaints, who carried fear in their breathing. The courthouse itself rose from the earth with the plain austerity characteristic of the region: thick timber beams, wide planks darkened by humidity, windows shuttered against the insects that gathered in clouds each afternoon. Inside, the air smelled of ink, paper dust, and the lingering odors of tobacco smoked late the previous night by the magistrate and his associates as they pored over petitions and unsettled accounts. The building was both the heart and the mask of the county, a place where official order was declared, yet also where unlawful bargains were struck quietly in back rooms, where the weight of a man's life could be altered by a private conversation that never found its way into the official ledger. Elias's responsibilities were modest in appearance but strategically placed, tending to the magistrate's office hearth, sweeping floors, filing papers under supervision, delivering sealed correspondence to the neighboring plantation houses, and running errands between the courthouse and the sheriff's residence. Such duties demanded silence, obedience, invisibility, qualities that the magistrate assumed were inherent in him. What the magistrate never recognized was that these same errands granted Elias access to rooms, documents, and conversations far more revealing than any free man would have allowed himself to observe. He passed each day absorbing the rhythms of authority, which planters approached the magistrate with excessive deference, which threatened behind polite smiles, which requested favors, which offered bribes, which feared exposure. The magistrate's household, attached to a wide tract of land outside the courthouse square, operated with the same structured gravity. The house, 2 stories of weather-beaten clapboard and narrow porches, leaned slightly forward as if bearing the weight of its own moral decay. Within its walls lived the magistrate, his wife Louisa, her frail sister Margaret, a rotating set of clerks who boarded temporarily, and a handful of enslaved laborers, though only Elias held the position of constant proximity to the magistrate's private affairs. The others, assigned to fieldwork or domestic service, moved in and out of the household's orbit with varying degrees of exhaustion and fear, yet even among them a quiet tension filled the air whenever the magistrate's steps were heard entering a room. On the morning that marked the subtle beginning of change, though no one recognized it at the time, Elias had been sent to retrieve a box of old writs stored in the courthouse attic. Few entered that cramped, dust-laden space, for it smelled of mold and long-dead insects. But the magistrate required several documents concerning unsettled land disputes near the river. Elias climbed the ladder with the cautious steps of someone accustomed to evaluating every creak and shift in wood, and when he entered the low attic room, the dim light from the single window revealed dust swirling in slow spirals, disturbed by the gentle current of his movements. It was here, in the room nearly forgotten by those who claimed to govern the county, that Elias first encountered an inconsistency that unsettled him. Among the stacks of packets tied with brittle twine, he noticed a ledger page that had slipped between two boxes. The sheet bore a faint watermark indicating it belonged to the magistrate's private accounting book rather than any public record. At first glance, the page appeared ordinary, a list of numerical entries and commodity transactions, but the dates did not align with the known seasonal patterns of cotton trade. More strangely, a column of initials repeated with curious frequency, initials belonging to a plantation owner whose estate had been rumored for years to carry unspoken scandals. Elias tucked the page deeper into the pile rather than risk exposure by pocketing it. Yet he memorized the numbers, committing the details to the quiet archive of his mind. Below him, in the courthouse hallway, he heard the magistrate's voice rise suddenly in a tone that suggested agitation rather than authority. Elias paused, listening. The words were distorted by distance, but certain phrases surfaced clearly. Dead, unaccounted, shipment delayed, and we cannot let this be seen. Another voice responded, perhaps that of Sheriff Wardell, rougher, more impatient. Then came a softer phrase, spoken too quietly for any average listener to catch, but Elias heard it. Dispose of it tonight. No record. Silence followed, broken only by the low hum of distant cicadas. He descended the ladder with measured calm, carrying the designated box of writs. He did not look up when he passed the magistrate and sheriff in the hall, though he sensed the charged air between them. The sheriff's boots were coated with a fine layer of riverbank mud, an unusual detail for that early hour, for he typically began his rounds only after sunrise. And the magistrate's coat smelled faintly of smoke, though no fires had been lit since the previous evening. These observations, insignificant to any who lived without fear, accumulated in Elias like pieces of a puzzle whose shape he had long sensed but never seen fully. Later that afternoon, the courthouse square filled with the usual movements, farmers carrying sacks of grain, a merchant arguing over disputed weights, a widow petitioning for protection from a neighboring landowner, a pair of enslaved men brought in chains to answer accusations of theft. The magistrate presided with a facade of impartial dignity, reading documents in a tone both rehearsed and rigid, yet behind him Elias could see the subtle tightening of his jaw whenever certain accounts were mentioned. It was as if the morning conversation continued to echo within him, threatening to pierce the veil of authority he relied upon to maintain order. During a brief recess, Elias stepped outside to sweep the courthouse porch. The air hung thick with humidity, and the scent of pine resin drifted from the carpenter's workshop down the road. As he swept, two clerks from the magistrate's office stood near the steps, speaking in hushed tones. They spoke of a man who had died the previous night near the river, an overseer from the South Plantation District. The clerks speculated about alcohol, missteps, and misfortune, but one detail broke the pattern of careless gossip. The body had been found without the overseer's ledger, a book he always carried to record punishments, allocations, and rations. The magistrate had issued strict orders that the matter not be discussed publicly. Elias continued sweeping, his posture unchanged, but inside him an old, familiar weight expanded, the tension between knowledge and silence. He had learned long ago that information was both a weapon and a liability. A single overheard sentence could condemn him if repeated unwisely, yet could also save him someday if used with precision. The world granted him no voice, yet burdened him with truths others preferred to ignore. That evening, within the magistrate's household, the atmosphere felt unusually constrained. Louisa Halbert's face held the pallor of someone who had endured a sleepless night. Her sister Margaret sat near the window, knitting with trembling fingers. The clerks ate their supper in forced politeness. Elias moved through the motions of service, pouring water, clearing plates, replenishing candles, while observing the subtle shifts in expression that revealed private fears. When the magistrate entered the dining room, conversation ceased entirely. His eyes were ringed with exhaustion, and his coat carried the faint lingering odor of river mud. He spoke little, ate quickly, and retreated to his study with a severity that signaled he did not wish to be disturbed. Elias later carried a tray of unused candles to the magistrate's study. Through the partially closed door he saw the magistrate hunched over his desk, pen scratching rapidly across paper. The room was lit by a single lantern, casting long shadows across the walls. Papers lay scattered in disordered piles, some marked with seal wax, others bearing the faded ink of older entries. On the corner of the desk rested the magistrate's private ledger, the book from which the attic page had likely fallen. Elias approached with silent tread, setting the candle tray on the small side table. As he turned to leave, the magistrate spoke without lifting his gaze. "Close the door, and tell no one I am working at this hour." Elias closed the door. He did not speak. Later, as he prepared to extinguish the lanterns in the corridor, he heard movement outside, a wagon passing slowly along the road, its wheels muffled by thick mud. An object thudded onto the ground, followed by murmured voices. He stepped to the window, but kept to the shadows. Two figures lifted a heavy burlap-wrapped shape from the wagon bed and carried it toward the small shed behind the courthouse. Even in the faint moonlight, Elias recognized Sheriff Wardell's silhouette. The other man, broader in the shoulders, moved with the stiffness of someone accustomed to violent work. They opened the shed door, shoved the wrapped weight inside, and bolted the latch. The incident lasted less than a minute, yet it confirmed the quiet pattern Elias had begun to detect. Something in the county's hidden machinery had shifted. The magistrate, the sheriff, the clerks, the plantation overseers, all seemed bound by a secret undercurrent that tightened around them like a rope being pulled slowly through unseen hands. 2 days later, while carrying correspondence to the northern road, Elias encountered another trace of this concealed tension. Passing a farmhouse near the county border, he overheard a quarrel between the landowner and his wife. Her voice, sharp with panic, spoke of letters, anonymous letters, sent to merchants accusing the magistrate of mismanaging funds and concealing violent crimes. The landowner dismissed her concerns with gruff irritation, yet the fear in her voice indicated that the letters held persuasive power. Elias continued walking, mind absorbing this new revelation. Someone, or something, had begun undermining the magistrate's authority from within the county itself. That night, as he lay on his pallet, sleep refused him. His thoughts returned to the attic ledger page, the magistrate's hurried writing, the sheriff's midnight labor, the missing overseer's book, and the whispers of anonymous letters. What troubled him most was not the growing suspicion surrounding the magistrate, but the realization that the county's silent order, the structure that held both the powerful and the powerless in predetermined positions, had developed cracks. And in those cracks, opportunity lived. He did not yet imagine the full extent of what would come. He did not foresee the investigations, the arrests, the accusations hurled across the courthouse floor, the terror that would sweep through the plantations, or the way a single voice, hidden behind ink and darkness, would reshape the fate of the entire county. But he sensed the first stirrings of something dangerous, something that demanded caution and clarity. And as the cicadas screamed in the trees outside, he understood one truth with unmistakable certainty. The county was beginning to listen, even if it did not yet know whose voice it heard. The first letter was no bigger than a palm and no longer than a hymn verse. Elias wrote it in the dark, the flame of a tallow stub slanting dangerously close to the scrap of paper he had flattened over a plank. He wrote slowly, silently, measuring each stroke like a man placing stones across a swollen river. His handwriting, rarely practiced, was narrow and careful, each letter pressed as close as ribs, as though conserving not paper but courage. He did not sign a name. He did not dare. He folded the scrap twice, slid it into the hollow where the floorboard bent ever so slightly near the corner of the sleeping shed, and waited for dawn. The county woke with its usual gray heaviness, the rattle of wagon wheels, roosters calling too early, the overseer's cough. The courthouse bell told the hour, 6, and Elias slipped from the shed with the movements of a man invisible by necessity. He walked as if going to the well, but his feet cut slightly left, toward the back fence where a gap beneath the rail lay hidden by sumac leaves. He left the folded scrap beneath the stones where the road narrowed. He did not look back. To survive such a deed, one must become the thing one fears, a shadow, a rumor, a passing wind. The man who found the letter was a traveling tinsmith, pausing to adjust the strap of a wheelbarrow. He saw the bit of paper, shrugged, tucked it into his coat, and walked on toward town. That innocent gesture, a stranger's indifference, became the hinge on which the county's fate would turn. The tinsmith sold ladles and patched pots until noon, then set his cart outside the apothecary and unthinkingly used the folded paper to wrap a bottle of laudanum. The bottle went to Mrs. Caro, who brought it home, unwrapped it, set the paper aside, and then, as if summoned by the ink itself, unfolded it. She read the lines twice, then a third time. By dusk, it had been whispered across 3 households. By nightfall, it had reached the ear of the magistrate's clerk. Elias knew none of this. Not yet. He only knew the physical sickness that hit him whenever he replayed the act in his mind. Had anyone seen him? Had he left a print, a thread, a shadow out of place? Would the letter reach anyone at all? Would it simply blow away and rot in the ditch, leaving him with the guilt of having risked everything for nothing? He tried to work as usual. At the courthouse, he swept floors, carried firewood, and emptied spittoons. He watched, he listened. It was his gift and his curse. He heard what others ignored. He remembered what they forgot. And by the second day, the air in the courthouse had changed. The magistrate arrived earlier than usual, shoulders high, movements quick. His clerk spoke in low, clipped sentences. 2 merchants came to settle a dispute over a lost shipment, but left pale and rattled, whispering to each other under the eaves. Elias heard the clerk say, "Sir, it may simply be mischief." To which the magistrate replied, "No mischief carries details drawn from private accounting." Elias kept his eyes lowered. His pulse thudded at his throat. The letter had reached them. He had written only facts. 3 shipments unrecorded, 2 payments rerouted to the magistrate's nephew, 1 judgment altered after a promise exchanged. Nothing more. No accusations, no names, only events and sums. He had thought that restraint would make the letter safer, more deniable, less likely to trace back to a single hand. He had not anticipated the shock it would cause. By the week's end, the county's merchants whispered in tight clusters. Overseers on distant plantations began asking strange questions. Who had been seen leaving the courthouse? Had anyone spoken to outsiders? Had travelers lingered near the magistrate's home? Elias felt the pressure tightening around him, not directly, not yet, but present like a rope coiling on the floor. It was the third night after the first letter that he decided to write a second. This one he wrote faster, with more certainty, though his hand trembled as he pressed the quill. A drop of ink splattered near the margin. He dabbed it carefully. The shed was silent except for the crickets outside and the distant hoot of an owl. He wrote of something he had overheard. The magistrate in hushed argument with his brother-in-law, speaking of debts he could not pay, of a deed altered by candlelight, of the need to crush the spark before it spreads. Elias read it twice, folded it, then sat motionless for nearly an hour. Every breath felt stolen. Every heartbeat felt like trespass. He placed the letter not on the roadside this time, but beneath the loose plank in the courthouse woodpile. A different route, a different risk. By dawn it would be in someone's hands. By dusk it would be in everyone's thoughts. Rumors swelled like a rising storm. Some said thieves had targeted the magistrate's storehouse. Others whispered that a rival county was sending spies. Some murmured of curses, of disgruntled clerks, of offended preachers. No one suspected a slave. The county's prejudices became Elias's shield. But the overseers noticed the tension, and they responded with suspicion of their own. Questions followed. Where were you on the night the courthouse lantern burned late? Who was near the back gate when the dogs barked? Why was there a footprint by the road where no one should walk? A woman named Ruth, who worked in the magistrate's kitchen, was questioned longest. She returned to the quarters with bruises along her arms. She said little, only whispered to Elias as they passed, "Someone stirring up the hornet nest." His stomach turned cold. He had done this. He had drawn others into the current with him, and they did not even know why. That same night, as Elias swept the courthouse corridor, he heard the clerk muttering in the records room. The door was ajar. The smell of burning paper drifted out, sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Elias slowed, barely letting his broom bristles touch the wood. Inside, the clerk fed sheets into a small iron brazier. Some were full pages, others torn strips. Deeds, receipts, correspondence. The clerk's face shone with sweat. He worked like a man erasing footprints before dawn. "Has anyone else seen these?" he whispered to himself. A moment later, "If the magistrate falls, I fall with him." He tossed another folded page into the flame. Elias took a single backward step, then another. If he made any sound, he was finished. The clerk paused. Elias froze. The clerk resumed burning. When Elias returned to the corridor, he realized he had been holding his breath. That night he did not sleep. Something inside him, fear, guilt, purpose, would not allow rest. He lay on his pallet staring at the beams above. The wood was old and cracked, intersecting like the ribs of a great animal that had long since died. He thought of Ruth's bruises. He thought of the clerk burning documents. He thought of the magistrate's rising paranoia. And he knew the letters had drawn blood, and there was no turning back. But doing nothing would be its own betrayal. So he wrote again. This third letter was shorter than the others, its message so sharp it cut the page. A record burned is a truth revealed. Seek the clerk, not the stranger. He hid it deep within a crate of flour bound for the merchant's store. By the time the crate reached town and the sack was opened, someone would notice the folded scrap. Paper traveled quickly in this county. Secrets traveled faster. And this time the reaction was immediate. By the next afternoon, Elias saw two constables speaking to the clerk behind the courthouse. The clerk laughed nervously, shaking his head too quickly, too often. His eyes were wild. Elias saw panic blooming behind his polite smile. That evening, lantern light glowed in the upstairs window of the magistrate's house long past midnight. Voices rose and fell. A woman cried. A door slammed. The storm had shifted direction. 2 days later, a different kind of trouble arrived. Elias returned from carrying water to find the overseer waiting at the edge of the quarters, arms folded, jaw set. "You," he said, pointing at Elias. "Magistrate wants some of the courthouse folk questioned." "Stand straight." Elias obeyed. Fear crawled beneath his skin like insects under bark. The overseer asked simple things at first. Had he seen anyone near the records room? Had any strangers passed by the courthouse? Had any slaves been acting unnatural, quiet, restless, too watchful? Elias kept his answers plain and soft. He had practiced for this. He had lived his whole life practicing for this, being nothing, being wind, being shadow. But the overseer's eyes narrowed. "You keep your head too clear," he muttered. "Too many thoughts for a quiet man." Elias felt the ground give beneath him. The world almost tilted. Then, as if summoned by Providence, another worker shouted from the far side of the yard. A mule had broken loose from its tether. The overseer cursed, turned, and hurried off. Elias exhaled only when the man was gone. He had not cracked, but the margin between safety and discovery had shrunk to a knife's width. That night, the workers whispered of disappearances. A clerk from the courthouse had not been seen all day. 2 constables had been sent upriver on urgent business. And the magistrate had closed his windows, something he had done only when suffering migraines or protecting secrets. Elias listened, silent. The county was shifting under its own weight. People who once walked tall now stepped carefully, looking over their shoulders. He understood the danger perfectly. Panic could turn unpredictable, and unpredictable men were the ones who whipped, jailed, or hanged without reason. His conscience churned. Had he done right? Or had he set a fire that would consume everything, even the innocent? He thought of the moral line he had crossed. A slave was not allowed thoughts, let alone judgments. Yet he possessed both, and they roared within him like a caged river. He picked up the quill again. Not because he was fearless, not because he was righteous, but because the truth, once known, would not leave him in peace. He began writing the 4th letter. His hand shook, but he did not stop. The candle guttered low. Outside, cicadas droned endlessly, indifferent to the human secrets thickening in the night. Elias wrote into the darkness, the ink reflecting the flame like a blade. He did not yet know that this letter would finally draw the county's rage into full daylight. He only knew that silence was no longer possible. The rise had begun, and there was no returning to stillness. The heat settled over the county like a damp cloth pressed against a feverish brow, thick and smothering, a weight that blurred days into one another and made every breath taste of iron and dust. Weeks had passed since the 3rd letter, and the tone of the county had shifted from suspicion to outright fear. Elias could feel it every time he walked through the courthouse yard. The whispered conversations that snapped shut when footsteps approached, the stiff-backed vigilance of constables who had once been lazy in their routines, the way even the wind seemed to hesitate before passing the magistrate's house. The 4th letter had traveled farther than he intended. He had left it beneath a wagon bound for the river landing, expecting it to circulate only among the merchants in town. But instead it had been carried to a trading post 3 counties over, and someone there, curious, irritated, perhaps merely bored, had forwarded it to a church official in Natchez. Within a week, the letter, with its dry, almost clerical account of the magistrate's hidden dealings, had landed on the desk of a man who kept meticulous records and had little tolerance for irregularities among public officers. That man, in turn, had sent a polite but pointed inquiry back downriver. The magistrate had received the inquiry 2 mornings later. Elias had not been in the room to see his reaction, but he had heard it. Every worker on the property had. The man's roar carried across the yard like cannon fire. By noon, riders were dispatched. By dusk, the first retaliations began. Overseers swept through the slave quarters with lanterns and questions sharpened like hooks, overturning bedding, digging beneath loose floorboards, rifling through buckets, blankets, and hidden corners where people kept the few private tokens they owned. A woman cried when an overseer smashed the tiny wooden carving her late husband had made for her. Another screamed when her child was dragged outside so her pallet could be flipped. Elias endured 3 inspections in 2 days, standing stiff as wood while an overseer dug through his scant belongings and eyed his hands for ink stains. The man found nothing, but that did not soften his gaze. Suspicion, once awakened, clung to the county like a stubborn weed. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere grew worse. The clerk, already frayed at the edges, now moved with the twitchy alertness of a hunted rabbit. He muttered to himself as he carried armfuls of documents from one room to another, stacking them in uneven piles that toppled if breathed upon. Elias watched him closely, sweeping near the door frames, listening as the clerk ranted about traitors and saboteurs and outsiders who wanted to ruin everything he had worked to maintain. Occasionally, the clerk paused to glare at Elias, as though half expecting him to sprout wings and fly away or burst into confession. The magistrate was worse, silent for long hours, then unpredictable, ordering searches, canceling court sessions, snapping at his wife, pacing the veranda with the stiff legs of a man expecting attack from the shadows. Elias sensed the man was no longer trying to preserve justice or reputation. He was fighting for the protection of his secrets, and secrets demanded blood. Meanwhile, the enslaved population lived in a pressure cooker of fear and mistrust. Families whispered accusations at night, unsure whether to fear overseers or each other more. Some believed the culprit was a field hand with a grudge. Others blamed the magistrate's own servants. A few, in more despairing moments, thought it might be a spirit or an omen, punishment for the county's sins. Every rumor twisted the air tighter. Elias kept his head low and his face blank, though inside he felt himself shredding. Each new search, each bruise he saw on someone who had been questioned, drove another splinter of guilt into his ribs. More than once he was tempted to burn the remaining scraps of paper hidden under the loose plank, to bury the quill, to step back into silence. But the clerk's frantic document burning, the magistrate's explosive rage, and the sight of one man dragged away after shouting that he didn't know nothing about no letters made Elias understand that he had crossed a threshold of no return. Stopping now would not stop the violence. Stopping would only abandon the truth he had already unleashed. The tipping point arrived during the second week of raids. A young man named Jonah, barely 17, vanished. He had been questioned that afternoon by 2 overseers, then taken behind the smokehouse for further clarification. When night fell, he did not return to the quarters. The next morning his mother sat on her pallet, staring straight ahead, hands covering her mouth as though holding back an animal scream. No one dared ask questions. No one dared look toward the woods. But everyone knew. The disappearance hung over the county like a storm cloud that refused to break, its weight heavy, electric, and poisonous. Elias felt the heaviness pressing on him most of all. Jonah had been quiet, gentle, someone who kept to himself and rarely spoke. He had been trusting. If the overseers tortured him, if they forced him to say names, Elias clenched his fists until his nails cut into his palms. He could not allow another disappearance. He could not remain a silent witness while others paid for his actions. It was on that same night, under the humid darkness thick with mosquitoes, that he chose his next step. He had already risked death writing short letters. Now he would write a long one, a detailed one. A document not merely hinting at corruption, but laying out the magistrate's misdeeds with the clarity and precision of a court transcript. It felt like stepping onto a scaffold and placing the noose around his own neck, but he did it. He waited long after the others in the quarters fell asleep, then retrieved his hidden ink and scraps. The quill had worn to a soft point. He sharpened it with a stolen sliver of iron until it cut cleanly. Sweat trickled down his spine as he dipped the quill and began. The letter grew slowly, like a bruise spreading under the skin. He detailed the altered judgments he had overheard, the payments redirected, the secret meetings with land agents, the quiet threats, the nighttime burning of records. He wrote of the clerk's panicked destruction of evidence. He described dates, sums, overheard names, anything he had observed over the years that resembled corruption or fraud. He avoided exaggeration. He did not lie. He relied only on memory, and his memory was sharp. As he wrote, he felt both steady and trembling, filled with dread but also a clarity he had never known. The truth poured from him like water that had been dammed too long, forcing its way through. He wrote until the candle's flame sagged low and nearly drowned in melted wax. This letter he would not hide locally. It would not be left on a road or slipped beneath a crate. It needed to travel far beyond the magistrate's reach. It needed someone with influence, not a merchant, not a clerk, but a man who saw justice not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. Elias had heard years ago of a newspaper editor in Baton Rouge who had once printed criticisms of local officials despite threats. Whether the man still lived or cared, Elias did not know. But the chance existed, and that chance was enough. He folded the long letter several times, wickedly aware that the bulk of it alone could condemn him if found. Then he waited 2 days for the right moment. The opportunity arrived when a trader stopped at the plantation seeking to repair a wagon wheel. Elias offered water, moved tools for him, pretended to admire the iron fittings. When the trader set his coats and satchels on the ground, Elias palmed the folded letter and slipped it into the side pocket of a canvas bag. It was a fragile act, balanced between hope and ruin. The bag was bound for Baton Rouge. If the trader discovered the letter, Elias might be beaten or killed on suspicion alone. If the letter reached its destination, the whole county might buckle under the weight of truth. He stepped away, heart hammering so violently he feared the trader might hear it. For 3 days afterward, Elias lived as though every second might be his last. The overseers raided again, more violently this time. They overturned buckets, ripped blankets, and snarled accusations. Ruth was struck across the mouth when she hesitated to answer a question. A man named Caleb was whipped for supposedly hiding something beneath his mattress, though it turned out to be nothing more than a wooden spoon he had carved for his daughter. The brutality, justified under the guise of finding the culprit, spread like fire through dry grass. The tension escalated further when the magistrate called all enslaved workers to the yard for a full inspection. They were forced to stand in lines under the suffocating afternoon sun while constables paced before them, eyes sharp as razors. The magistrate himself emerged from his house, face stiff as stone, his expression so cold it chilled the air around him. He accused them collectively of sabotage, conspiracy, treasonous intent. He claimed that someone among them had tried to undermine lawful authority. His voice rose, then cracked, a sign of how deeply the situation had shaken him. Elias stood in the 4th row, sweat streaming down his back, palms clammy. He kept his gaze low, his breathing shallow. The magistrate walked close enough that Elias could smell his cologne, sharp, floral, out of place in the humid air. The man's eyes scanned each face as if searching for a flicker of guilt. When his gaze passed over Elias, something tightened between them. Elias felt it, a momentary prickle of awareness, but the magistrate moved on. The inspection ended without a confession, which only worsened the magistrate's fury. That evening the workers were restricted from leaving the quarters. The overseers circled the area like wolves. Families huddled tightly, whispering, praying, trembling. Every sound felt magnified, the creak of boards, the thump of footsteps, the distant rumble of thunder gathering over the river. Elias lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the air press down like a lid. He could no longer separate fear from purpose. Both lived inside him, snarling and intertwined. Days crawled forward like wounded animals. The tension settled into the bones of the county, transforming every routine into a trial. In the courthouse, Elias worked with the weight of invisible chains, his ears hyper-attuned, his steps measured, his fingers tense to hide any trace of ink if needed. The magistrate's paranoia spiraled. He ordered the clerk to inventory every scrap of paper in the archives. He demanded daily reports from constables. He questioned merchants about incoming mail. He had even sent a rider southward, though no one knew why. Despite all this, the letter must have reached Baton Rouge. Elias could feel its distant impact spreading back toward him like a tremor. Something changed in the air, subtle but unmistakable. People in town began talking less about finding the culprit and more about what might come next. Some speculated the magistrate was being investigated. Others feared external authorities would intervene. A few hinted that a scandal was about to break wide open. This shift did not bring relief, only deeper dread. Elias understood that when the truth grows too large to hide, powerful men become dangerous in new, unpredictable ways. And now the magistrate, cornered and fearful, was a man with everything to lose and the authority to destroy anyone who threatened him. One evening, after a long day of courthouse tensions and sharp whispers, Elias sensed that the air itself was bracing for impact. A storm rolled in over the hills, lightning flickering silently behind heavy clouds. Thunder muttered like a distant warning. The workers moved restlessly in the quarters, children wailing, adults pacing. The storm's oppressive energy settled in their chests, making breath shallow and thoughts loud. Elias sat on his pallet, knees drawn up, hands clasped tightly. He felt the truth rising inside him. He had indeed gone too far to stop now. Jonah's disappearance, the bruises on Ruth's arms, the terror gripping the county. These were not consequences he could retreat from. Silence was no longer a refuge. It was complicity. And though guilt gnawed at him like an insatiable creature, he sensed also a terrible necessity, as though some ancient balance demanded reckoning, and he had been unwillingly chosen to tip the scales. Yet a question haunted him with the persistence of a fever. Was he delivering justice, or merely destruction? Were his letters a light, or a spark that might swallow the entire county in flames? His conscience wavered between righteousness and self-condemnation. He wanted to believe he was fighting for the truth, but he could not deny the trail of suffering behind him. Still, the deeper he stepped into danger, the clearer it became that truth, once unearthed, demanded full exposure. Injustice fortified by silence was the greater evil. As thunder cracked overhead and rain began to strike the roof in thick, uneven sheets, Elias understood that the storm outside mirrored the one he had unleashed. Everything was moving toward a breaking point. The magistrate's grip was slipping. Fear had become the county's constant companion, and the letter now traveling southward was no longer a private whisper. It was an arrow aimed at the heart of power. Whatever came next, confrontation, investigation, more violence, was inevitable. Elias could feel it in his bones, in the air, in the restless tremble of the night. He had crossed the threshold. The climax had begun its slow, inexorable approach. The storm that had been swelling at the edge of the horizon for days finally broke the night the magistrate's suspicions closed tightly enough around the household to begin drawing blood. Summer rain hammered the roof in thick, slanted sheets, blowing through broken shutters and pooling in corners of the gallery where rotting wood sagged under its own damp weight. The house felt alive that evening, breathing, groaning, settling under the pressure of secrets that no longer wished to remain still. Elias sensed it even before he stepped out of the pantry where he had just hidden the last of his ink beneath a loose stone. There was a pulse in the air, a heavy thud-like rhythm echoing through the walls and along the floorboards, as if the structure itself were being prepared for confession. And somewhere deeper inside, muffled but certain, he heard a crash, furniture upended, a man shouting, footsteps scattering. The storm outside aligned perfectly with the one inside, as though nature itself had finally agreed to stop pretending it did not see what happened in the magistrate's home. Down the hall, voices escalated with a feverish intensity that Elias had never heard from the magistrate before. Normally, the man's rage was methodical, cold as a ledger, but tonight it was frantic and broken, laced with an edge of desperation that suggested he had crossed into a territory he could no longer control. Elias crept closer, barefoot and silent, his breath shallow as he kept to the shadows. He found a vantage point beside a half-curtained doorway, where he could see the magistrate overturning drawers and scattering letters, his own letters, across the floor, muttering in a strangled, almost delirious rhythm. The sheriff stood stiffly in the corner, drenched from the rain, hat in hand, watching with a grim discomfort that betrayed he had become an unwilling participant in a situation far darker than the duties of his office demanded. On the magistrate's desk, a single candle cast trembling light over an array of documents half-burned in a metal basin, fragments of confessions, receipts of extortion, names of families he had ruined. Elias immediately recognized one of the torn scraps, its handwriting unmistakably his own. His stomach plummeted. The magistrate had found part of the evidence he had sent out, and had traced it back, perhaps not yet personally to Elias, but certainly to the house. It was then that Clara burst into the room, face pale, breathing ragged, eyes flicking between the sheriff and her husband with the terror of someone who understood all too well the violence men in power commit when cornered. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, her dress darkened by rain, and she pointed a trembling finger toward the slave quarters outside, shouting that the overseers had dragged one of the men, Samson, Elias realized with a stabbing dread, into the mud and were beating him for information. The magistrate did not even look at her. He simply ordered the sheriff to let the interrogations continue, harder if needed. The sheriff opened his mouth to protest, then shut it again, jaw tightening. He obeyed. Clara tried to step in front of him, but one look from the magistrate, sharp and venomous, froze her in place. Her expression flickered with something like resignation, something that had grown inside her for years. Elias slipped away before anyone noticed him, his heart pounding so violently it seemed impossible the entire house did not hear it. He made his way down the service stairs, through the back hallway, and out toward the porch where the storm raged. The world outside was chaos. Overseers shouting through the downpour, guards running with lanterns flickering wildly, rain turning the yard into a shifting mire where shadows lurched and struggled. And there, in the center of it all, half kneeling in the mud, Samson gasped for breath as two overseers held his arms and shoulders, demanding answers he could not give. Elias felt the instinct to run, to flee into the storm, into the woods, anywhere but here, but something faster, colder, rooted him in place: responsibility. Samson had no part in this, and Elias knew that every lash, every fist, every threat pressed against that man's ribs was the direct consequence of words Elias himself had written. With a force he did not know he possessed, Elias rushed forward. Not openly, not in sight. He kept low, weaving through the shadows of the porch, the garden pots overturned by wind, the wall of rain that offered temporary blindness to both hunter and hunted. He reached the edge of the yard and watched, trembling, as the overseers argued about whether to drag Samson to the smokehouse, a place where interrogations often ended with bodies being carried out before dawn. The decision seemed inevitable, seconds away. And then, from across the yard, Clara appeared again, soaked and desperate, screaming at them to stop. But the overseers, empowered by the magistrate's orders, did not heed her. One of them pushed her aside, so roughly she fell into the mud. The image seared itself into Elias's mind, her hair smearing across the ground, her hands sinking into the wet earth, her expression twisted with helpless fury. Something snapped inside him. He slipped through the storm's cover and reached Clara, helping her back to her feet as quietly as he could. Her eyes widened when she recognized him, but she said nothing. Her breath trembled against the wind. Together they watched as the overseers dragged Samson toward the smokehouse door. Elias felt Clara's hand grip his sleeve, not in fear, but in something closer to entreaty. She whispered that her husband had gone mad with paranoia, that he had received not just Elias's letters, but responses from men outside, men who insinuated that an informant was exposing his financial crimes. The magistrate had turned on everyone. "He will kill someone by morning," she said. "He might already have killed someone tonight." Those words hardened something inside Elias. He knew then that his work was no longer about letters or evidence. It had escalated beyond ink. His actions had drawn blood, and only a decisive act, a human, physical one, could bring the truth to light before more lives were taken. He left Clara beneath the porch awning and made his way along the outskirts of the yard, keeping low, watching the overseers disappear with Samson. The storm gave him cover, but also urgency. Any chance he had to intervene or expose the magistrate had to happen now, while the chaos tore open cracks in the household's routines. Through the sheets of rain, he saw a lantern approach from the direction of the stables. A hunched figure moved awkwardly beneath its dim halo. Elias froze, then recognized the magistrate himself, bareheaded, soaked, and wild-eyed, carrying a small metal box pressed tightly against his chest. Elias knew immediately what it was, the household's private record box. Inside were documents the magistrate had refused to let even his clerks see. Insurance claims, letters of blackmail, receipts of illegal sales, lists of bribes paid to judges and merchants. But the magistrate wasn't heading toward the courthouse. He was heading toward the old well behind the smokehouse. Elias followed at a distance, heart hammering. The storm roared, but the magistrate's muttering was still audible. He repeated the same words over and over. "Burn it all. Bury it all. No one must know." His steps slipped in the mud, but he continued with frenzied urgency until he reached the well. He set the lantern beside it, pried open the lid of the metal box, and began throwing handfuls of documents into the darkness below. The rain soaked most pages before they fell, but Elias could see enough in the brief flashes of lantern light to recognize the magistrate's spidery handwriting across dozens of them. Elias stepped forward then, unintentionally, perhaps, and a branch cracked beneath his foot. The magistrate spun around, lantern swinging wildly, casting a whipping light across the rain-soaked yard. His face, contorted with rage and terror, froze on Elias. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other. The wind howled between them. Then the magistrate reached for the pistol on his belt. Elias reacted before thought could intervene. He lunged forward, grasped the lantern, and flung it to the ground, smashing it into darkness. The magistrate shouted, a blend of outrage and fear, and fired blindly into the storm. The shot echoed through the yard, followed by a desperate scramble as the magistrate tried to reload with trembling hands. Elias seized the moment, rushing toward him, tackling him hard enough that both fell into the mud. The pistol flew from the magistrate's grasp, landing several feet away. Rain hammered them as they wrestled. The magistrate far stronger, fueled by years of unchecked authority and tonight's festering panic. Elias felt his hands slipping, his breath burning, the mud sucking at his limbs like a living thing trying to pull him down. The magistrate's fingers clamped around his throat, pressing with a force that made spots bloom in Elias's vision. He felt himself losing air, losing ground, losing consciousness. Then a scream tore through the storm. Clara. Her voice carried enough agony to cut through the rain. The magistrate hesitated, just for a second, but enough. Elias mustered the last shred of strength he possessed, wrenched himself free, and struck the magistrate across the temple with the corner of the metal record box. The man slumped sideways into the mud, groaning in pain but alive. Elias crawled to his feet, gasping. At the smokehouse door, Clara struggled with one of the overseers who had attempted to restrain her. The second overseer held Samson by the hair, preparing to drag him inside. Samson's face was swollen, blood trickling from his brow, his breath shallow. Elias knew that if Samson entered that smokehouse, he would not emerge. With the storm masking his approach, Elias grabbed the fallen pistol, aimed it with trembling hands, and shouted for them to stop. The overseers froze, not because they respected Elias, but because they recognized the weapon. And behind them, in the mud, the magistrate stirred, groaning Elias's name with venom soaked in disbelief. That moment, lightning flashing, rain pouring, overseers staring, Clara gasping, Samson sagging, held the fate of every person in the yard. Elias understood what he must do. He told Clara to take Samson and run to the sheriff, who still lingered uncertainly between obedience and conscience. He told the overseers to step away unless they wished to join their master in the well. And he told the magistrate, now fully conscious, eyes blazing with hatred, that the truth would be known by morning, no matter what happened tonight. The magistrate lunged then, too quickly for a man already beaten. Elias fired once, the gunshot swallowed by thunder. The magistrate collapsed face first into the mud, breath hitching, blood mixing with rainwater as he lay motionless. Clara screamed. Samson sagged. The overseers scattered into the storm, suddenly cowardly when their authority lay dying in the dirt. Elias knelt beside the magistrate, not with triumph, but with a profound, shattering exhaustion. The magistrate's eyes flickered once more, unfocused. His voice rasped a final whisper, something Elias had to lean close to hear. You should have stayed silent. Then he went still. The storm raged on. Elias remained kneeling for a long time, longer than he realized, letting the rain wash the blood from his hands, letting the weight of what he had done settle into his bones. He did not know if justice had been served or merely vengeance. He did not know if tomorrow would bring freedom, imprisonment, or death. All he knew was that silence had ended tonight, broken by letters, by courage, by guilt, by necessity, by blood, and that nothing in the magistrate's house would ever be the same. In the days that followed the magistrate's death, the county seemed to hold its breath, as though the land itself were unwilling to acknowledge the sudden void that had opened in the center of its fragile hierarchy. The storm that had ravaged the night of the confrontation gave way to a heavy, motionless humidity that hung low across the fields, making even the simplest tasks feel burdened with unseen consequence. There was no official announcement, no public ceremony. Word spread the way rot does, quietly, invisibly, until everyone tasted it without knowing when they first swallowed. Some said the magistrate slipped in the storm and fell on the stones. Others insisted it had been an argument with the overseers gone wrong. A few whispered the sheriff had shot him. And among the enslaved, the truth wove itself through murmurs exchanged at dawn and dusk, spoken only when no overseer's footstep echoed nearby. Elias had done what no one dared imagine, and somehow the world had not ended. At least, not yet. Newspapers from 2 neighboring towns arrived with cautious speculation, their articles penned by men who had no interest in destabilizing their own reputations by naming corruption outright. Instead, they danced around the issue, writing of mismanaged accounts, irregularities in legal documentation, and unexpected vacancy in a position of civic leadership. One paper mentioned an anonymous whistleblower, but only in a single line, buried 2 columns down, as if the editor regretted including it even as he wrote the word. Farmers spoke more freely, at taverns, markets, and fence lines, sharing rumors with the kind of thrill that comes when one realizes that power, even entrenched power, can bleed. They spoke of missing records, names on lists no one had supposed existed, bribes paid to men whose coats were now suspiciously new. They spoke of the sheriff riding out to the plantation 3 times in a week, each time leaving pale-faced and tight-lipped. And they spoke, too, of the magistrate's widow, who had not left her room since the storm, except for a single late-night visit to the well, where she stood for nearly an hour staring into the darkness below. For Elias, the days blurred into a thick, oppressive fog of waiting. Waiting for someone to ask him a question he could not answer honestly. Waiting for punishment he half expected with every dawn. Waiting for the moment the sheriff would return with men who would drag him into the courthouse basement for interrogation. But none of that happened. Instead, an unsettling quiet settled over the household. The overseers avoided him, though whether out of fear or suspicion he could not tell. Clara's interactions with him became wordless, full of glances that held gratitude and terror in equal measure. Samson, recovering slowly from his injuries, refused to speak of that night at all, treating silence as both shield and absolution. And the sheriff, when he did return, seemed disturbingly eager to leave as soon as he stepped inside, as if the walls of the magistrate's office whispered accusations he could no longer bear to hear. The metal box, the record box, was retrieved from the mud 2 days after the storm, though many of its contents had been ruined beyond recognition. Still, enough pages survived to ignite a quiet fire in the courthouse. In the depths of the building, clerks pieced together fragments. Land contracts altered to cheat widows of their husbands' estates, bribes paid to debt collectors, threats issued to poor farmers who had dared question tax assessments. One scrap listed 8 names, 4 white, 4 enslaved, each corresponding to disappearance inquiries, a phrase so vague and bureaucratic that its true horror required no further clarification. These documents did not circulate openly. The sheriff locked them away in a drawer only he had the key to. But rumors, once born, do not stay confined. The courthouse staff whispered of a system rotten to the foundation, and some, in hushed voices, wondered who else should be afraid now that the magistrate was no longer alive to take the blame. Elias sensed a slow shift in how people looked at him, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Not openly, not with confrontation, but in the lingering gazes, the abrupt silences when he entered a room, the way even some enslaved workers stepped aside for him not out of deference, but uncertainty. He had crossed a boundary none of them could articulate. To some he was dangerous. To others he was a symbol. To a few he was barely human anymore, more ghost than man, because anyone who had brought down the magistrate surely carried a shadow larger than himself. He felt these perceptions like weights pressing on different parts of his body. On his chest the fear that he had doomed them all, on his shoulders the knowledge that he had taken a life, in his hands the memory of the pistol's recoil and the magistrate's final rattling breath. The household faced a question no one wanted to ask, but everyone understood would determine its future. What was to be done with Elias? Clara, pale and brittle as dry paper, spoke softly to the sheriff one afternoon, her voice carrying through the half-open office door. Elias heard only fragments. He saved Samson. He saved me. My husband was not himself. The letters, if they knew. The sheriff's reply was lower, harder to decipher, but Elias caught one phrase clearly. If we free him publicly, questions will follow. Free him. The idea felt unreal, like a fever dream. And yet the alternative, he soon discovered, was equally surreal. The sheriff proposed relocating Elias quietly to another estate owned by the magistrate's distant cousin, an inheritance transfer, he called it, a way to keep the situation from drawing more scrutiny. Clara's voice trembled with anger at that suggestion. Then the door shut fully, and Elias heard no more. A week later, the decision still hung unresolved, suspended in bureaucratic purgatory where morality, practicality, and fear battled with no referee. In the meantime, Elias resumed much of his daily labor, though nothing felt the same. The ink-stained stone in the pantry remained where he had left it, untouched. No one dared move anything that might be evidence of something they were not sure they wanted proven. The quarters buzzed with an uneasy mix of hope and dread. Hope that something had fundamentally changed, dread that the overseers would reclaim control with twice the cruelty to compensate for their embarrassment. A few men spoke quietly of running north while confusion clouded the county. Others wanted to bury the memory of the letters as deeply as the magistrate had tried to bury his crimes, fearing that any mention of them might provoke retaliation from the landholding families. Still others, not many, but enough, whispered that Elias should speak to a newspaper, complete what he had begun, and ensure the truth spread beyond the county's reach. When Elias heard this, he felt a sharp, twisting panic. He knew firsthand the cost of truth. He was no longer certain he could bear more of it. In the evenings he sat behind the smokehouse, near the well where the magistrate had tried to erase his sins. The place had an aura now, a weight that made even the bravest overseer avoid it after dusk. Elias stared into the depths, remembering the sound of documents fluttering downward, remembering the magistrate's crazed voice, remembering his own hands gripping the pistol. He questioned himself endlessly. Had he acted out of justice or fear? Had he truly protected the others? Or had he simply accelerated chaos? And what of the letters? They had been born from the conviction that truth mattered, that the voiceless could shake a system if they found a way to speak. But the aftermath showed him truth's other face. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, requiring sacrifices no one could predict. When the sheriff finally returned with paperwork in hand, Elias felt something in his chest harden into a dense, immovable knot. The decision, whatever it was, would define the rest of his life. Clara remained inside, sitting stiffly in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap, unable, or unwilling, to witness the moment. Samson stood nearby, leaning on a cane, watching with silent intensity. The sheriff approached Elias slowly, as though afraid of what he might provoke by coming too close. He looked tired, older than before, as if the past week had aged him a decade. He held out a folded document. Elias took it, though his hands trembled. The paper did not free him. It transferred him, quietly, legally, without announcement, to a small, aging property on the far edge of the county, a place almost forgotten by the world. The sheriff spoke of reduced oversight, of better conditions, of distance from recent unrest. But Elias heard only the truth beneath the polished language. They feared him, and they feared the questions his presence would provoke. Freedom, they believed, would draw too much attention. Silence, as always, remained the county's preferred solution. That night, Elias lay awake in his cot, listening to the summer insects hum through the darkness. He felt no anger, no despair, only a vast, numbing emptiness. He had expected punishment or liberation. Instead, he received something murkier, something that resembled both exile and clemency. In a way, the decision mirrored his own actions, necessary, perhaps, but morally ambiguous. He wondered whether he should fight it, whether he should write one final letter, something loud enough to force the county's hand. But the thought filled him with exhaustion. He had already brought down one man. Bringing down a system was a task for someone stronger, someone untouched by the weight of a death. On the morning he was taken to the distant property, Clara approached him quietly. She did not speak at first. Then, with a trembling voice, she thanked him, not for killing her husband, but for preventing a tragedy that might have taken more lives. She said she did not know whether justice had been served, but she did know the magistrate had become a man capable of horrors she could no longer deny. Her hands shook as she spoke. She asked whether Elias regretted writing the letters. After a long silence, he told her he regretted the consequences, not the truth itself. She nodded, though her expression revealed she was not entirely sure what that meant. The new estate was smaller, quieter, almost colorless compared to the magistrate's sprawling land. The overseer was older, half-blind, uninterested in anything except maintaining enough order to keep his job. Elias found himself occupying a strange position, neither trusted nor feared, neither watched nor ignored. Days passed in a haze of work, reflection, and a gnawing uncertainty about whether he had improved the world or merely shifted suffering from one corner to another. Word from the old county traveled slowly, but he heard enough to piece together the fragments. The sheriff resigned. Clara left the plantation and returned to live with her sister. One overseer disappeared entirely. Whispers of missing records continued to circulate, though no formal investigation ever materialized. The magistrate's name, once spoken with authority, became a cautionary tale told in lowered voices. And yet, despite the silence of official channels, Elias knew the letters had not vanished. People remembered. Some were frightened by what he had done, others inspired, others uncertain. But no one forgot. In a society built on obedience and fear, even a single anonymous voice had proven capable of reshaping the course of lives. Elias carried that knowledge with him like a second heartbeat, steady, painful, undeniable. Weeks turned into a month. Fields ripened. The heat eased only slightly. And one evening, as he sat alone beneath a dead pecan tree overlooking the distant horizon, Elias felt an unfamiliar emotion settle quietly within him. It was not peace, not entirely, nor was it pride. It was something more complex, something he struggled to name. The understanding that justice is neither clean nor predictable, that the truth is a blade that cuts indiscriminately, and that survival often demands compromises no one teaches you to navigate. He closed his eyes and felt the wind brush his face, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from a faraway chimney. Somewhere, he thought, the letters still echoed. And in this final moment, we shift from his world to ours. If this were a story told in a YouTube video, this is where the narrator would lower his voice, lean close to the microphone, and ask the questions that linger long after the final frame fades to black. Would you have done what Elias did? Can justice ever be clean when obtained through lies, secrets, or violence? Does survival justify deception, or does it poison the truth it aims to protect? And if the voiceless finally find a way to speak, how far can they go before they become like the oppressor they seek to expose? These questions, like Elias's letters, do not offer comfort, only reflection.